Okay, welcome to today's panel, and it's really nice to have such a broad range of guests. We have a lot of different colleagues from different walks of life here in the room, I can see, but also online based on the registration. So it's nice to be broader and having broader discussions than just security, but thank you nonetheless for coming to humanitarian security today. To start us off, we are joined by 4 amazing panelists. Unfortunately, our colleague from WFP, David Katrude, is unable to join today and had to drop out last minute this morning. But I'm sure you'll nonetheless be excited to hear some of the conversation from the other panelists. We'll also have an opportunity for Q&A later in the session, about half an hour of Q&A, where colleagues online can raise their questions in the chat and we'll be monitoring, and colleagues in the room can unmute your microphone, raise your hand, and then we'll go to you. So I think to start things off, it's important to paint a picture of why are we having this conversation. As you'll know, the global security environment in 2024 and 2025 is deteriorating, certainly from our analysis and the pictures that we're seeing from Geneva. But as recently as last week, we had incidents attacking UN guest houses and offices, resulting in the deaths of humanitarian workers and injuries. So this is a stark challenge that we are facing in reality. Humanitarians are often working in increasingly challenging contexts filled with uncertainty and security risks to deliver their life-saving assistance. Just last week, we saw this in live form. In UNHCR, we have nearly a quarter of our workforce operating in locations of substantial or high security risk levels and using armed escorts across 20% of our operations, our country operations. We face direct threats as UNHCR daily to our personnel, to our operations, and to our premises. This panel today, we aim to discuss how we are navigating these high-threatened environments and the challenges that we currently see in relation to the use and the humanitarian use of armed escorts. Firstly, let's introduce our panelists. So I'd like to introduce the Director of Field Operations, William Blanchard, who's joining us today in the room with more than 3 decades of distinguished service in foreign affairs. He joined UNDSS and focuses on security operations. Prior to joining UNDSS, he worked with the United Kingdom in FCDO, serving as the Director of Strategic Advantage and Analysis and the Director of Counterterrorism. We also have Anne Carlson online, who is the Deputy Security Coordinator for UNICEF with more than 27 years of military and security experience, serving in multiple roles in Afghanistan, in Yemen, across Asia Pacific, and various senior security analysis functions. We're also joined by Alan Mordaunt, the Head of Global Security from Chokare. He joined the humanitarian sector following an extensive career in the military and UN peacekeeping operations, bringing a wealth of experience in crisis management, security strategy, and operational risk mitigation. He's passionate about strengthening collaboration, security frameworks that enhance access, resilience, and the safety of staff. And then last but certainly not least, we're joined by Florence Vanderboort from INSO. She's a regional analyst for the International NGO and Safety Organization. Florence worked across leadership positions as country director and also across security and access positions across complex operations such as Venezuela, Sudan, and Iran. And I'm Bridget Hancock from UNHCR, Senior Field Security Advisor and Civil Military Coordination. So let's get started. I think the best place to start is what kind of operations what kind of environments we are working in, Bill. What does today's high threat operating environment look like for humanitarian organizations?
Hello, everyone. So I'm Bill Blanchard, Director of Field Operations in DSS. In the United Nations. And to explain what the high threat environment looks like in, I think, 3 minutes is a little bit of a challenge, but I'll do my best. So it's hard to say whether threat, the quantity of threat, is ever increasing. It feels like that, but then we're always paying attention to the new ones, and sometimes we forget some other ones are going down. But what I think we can definitely say is that the diversity of the ranges of threats we face and the geographical places we face it is increasing. Terrorism is down, but not out completely. There are still places where we face that. Civil war and other conflict is widespread, probably more widespread than it has been. The threat directly from state actors is a factor that we are having to deal with more and more, and the UN lost a colleague and had others injured this week, as you know. The threat from various kinds of non-state actors, non-state armed groups, but also de facto authorities, some of whom are quite prepared to detain UN staff and other humanitarians. The threat from criminal groups. I mean, Haiti is the preeminent example, but actually criminality bleeds over into a range of other contexts. And then all of this amplified, I suppose, by the overarching threats of mis and disinformation, which can make the speed of a threat emerging faster, as well as its consequences more problematic. Occasionally, we have a threat from the people we're trying to help. We're not getting the food or the aid or whatever it is to them fast enough. It's too tempting to try and loot the lorry, or indeed, they see us pulling back because of the financial crisis we face, and they're angry about that. So there's a sort of a threat from a shrinking budget as well. And we need to take a wide range of measures to face these threats and to choose sort of selectively, subtly from the menu. And one risk that we must face, and I think we'll get onto in this conversation, is that we don't reduce the risks, or we don't reduce the measures when the risks go down. It's easier to put them up to manage the threat and to leave those measures in place when the risks come down. And that's a difficult one for us to manage for sort of psychological reasons, but then also vested interests. So I think I'll stop there. And that's a preamble before we get into the meat of the conversation.
Very useful preamble. And I'm hoping INSO can also paint a picture. Florence, what's INSO's current analysis on the context in relation to humanitarian access and community perception specifically?
Yes, thank you. Well, a little bit in the same line, of course, than my colleague there. There's so much to say about the global humanitarian context. So in relation to the topic of this session, I would like to highlight what we see now for NGOs and humanitarian organizations, that they face a significant acceptance crisis from both the authorities and the communities they aim to support. So this acceptance crisis is driven by a lot of factors, including increased political polarization. So the growing perception that humanitarian aid is aligned with political agendas or foreign influence. We also see a lot of disinformation, misinformation, and then, yes, we are facing a lack of time and resources to invest in deep community engagement and engagement with authorities. So we see that trend in a lot of regions. For example, in Sahel, we see that NGOs have struggled with restrictive government policies that greatly limit the movement and humanitarian access. To talk about Latin America, where I am now, and particularly in Venezuela, we see that humanitarian actors are viewed with suspicion and they are seen by some actors as agents of political opposition rather than neutral responders. And then, on the other hand, at the community level, there are also challenges. So in some contexts, local population may feel that aid distribution is unfair, insufficient, leading to frustration and a breakdown in trust. And again, in conflict zone, misinformation campaigns can portray NGOs as biased or aligned with one side, and that obviously complicates acceptance and access. So the reason why I insist on this topic of acceptance is because it's very much linked to the topic of armed escorts. We have contexts with armed escorts are imposed by authorities in a way to monitor or even control what humanitarian actors are doing, where they go, who the aid is to distribute it to, and so on. And when we think about other contexts where armed escorts are seen as an effective deterrent for safety risk, well, we can also ask ourselves how reinforcing acceptance strategies with communities could mitigate those risks instead of having to resort to armed escorts. So, same as a very short introduction, I think I'm going to leave it here to let you go to deeper and more concrete subjects.
Thank you so much, Florence. And talking about the reduction of community acceptance, perception of the community, and access in general, Alan, I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the challenges that you're seeing or that you're seeing organizations having to navigate in these environments.
Yeah, so lack of acceptance has been obviously mentioned multiple times. It's a huge problem for us because our primary security means is acceptance-based security. We're accepted by the communities we work in. Without access, we essentially can't build that relationship and we can't gain that acceptance that we need to work there. So it's a very difficult dilemma. And as Bill previously mentioned, the conflict, the sphere is growing. Our operational space is shrinking, so it's harder for us to reach those communities. Excuse me. And sometimes we end up, not purposely, but aligning ourselves with a state body, sometimes due to the fact that the location we're in is the capital city. It has the, access to Wi-Fi resources so that we can communicate to donors. But that alignment has a knock-on impact for our acceptance. And depending on how many directions that threat is coming from, that acceptance is key. So depending on our locations and the spread of our work, like it's essential that we keep our focus in on what keeps us safe, and that currently is our acceptance. The other dilemma then would be like our visibility. Some organizations opt for a high visibility model and some look at a low visibility model. So generally organizations that work in partnership have fairly low footprint. We have a very low footprint so that we can slip in and out quite easily. And then organizations, other organizations have the high visibility model, but whether that high visibility turns you into a target or not is another key factor. So there are things that are big questions for us all at the minute. And again, yeah, just I suppose a start into the greater questions.
Thank you, Alan. And I think the next question is for Anne on basically the high visibility model. So Anne, given the increasing prevalence of higher threat environments that we are operating, where security measures often require making difficult trade-offs, how do armed escorts fit into the overall security strategy, and what factors are considered in deciding on whether to use armed escorts by the UN?
Thanks, Bridget, and thank you for having me this afternoon or this morning, depending upon where you're seated. First and foremost, for us, armed escorts are only to be used as a last resort in humanitarian action when all other alternatives will not work. I'll refer to the IASC non-binding guidelines on the use of armed escorts. There are numerous alternatives outlined in that document that should be explored first, because they can have a significant negative impact on the perceptions of our neutrality, impartiality, and our independence. And this goes back to what Florence had mentioned and Alan about the need for acceptance, right? If communities distrust us, armed escorts may just exacerbate that distrust. So when we do use them, they should only be used as a last resort and when identified as a specific security risk management measure for a specific geographic area in a limited time frame. That's ideally how it should be set up And when deciding to use armed escorts, it's really important for the UN security management system to have wide consultations, not just in the security cell and the security management team, but with the humanitarian country team. Because when the UN decides to use armed escorts, there's often an implication for our INGO and NGO partners that they are also now using armed escorts. So that needs to be widely discussed and collaborated before deciding. Some of the considerations that we take into account, what is the humanitarian need? Are armed escorts the only way that we can really reach this population in need? In some cases, I think it is just touched upon, the local authorities mandate them. It's the only way that we can operate. I'll come back to that a little bit later in the discussion, but that can also prove a challenge. And in some specific cases, armed escorts are a credible deterrent, right? They are not a target. They enhance the security of personnel. They don't increase our risks. But it's important that we consider the short-term and the longer-term risk implications of using them. But overall, humanitarian convoys must retain their civilian nature and their civilian character. These perceptions of political influence and bias that Florence mentioned are really important to consider. And other than the vehicles, the weapons, the personnel, the armed escorts with the convoy are separated still in some kind of manner to give visibility to the civilian character of the humanitarian convoys. Things like no weapons markings on our vehicles are really important, and the distinctions that we can maintain, we should. Thanks, Bridget.
No, thank you, Anne. And the point on neutrality is definitely noted, and certainly that's our position in UNHCR as well. We're very similar to UNICEF in that regard. Alan, I'm wondering, in terms of the general trend on the use of armed escorts for international NGOs and national NGOs, what are you seeing? And then I'm also conscious to ask INSO the same in terms of the use of armed escorts from the NGO side.
From our side, it's not an area for discussion. It definitely comes up for very, very specific locations and for very specific reasons. Like an obvious example would be an evacuation of a team to an area where you don't have acceptance and you don't have access, and you know a road move is the only way out. But it's not something that comes across in conversations or in the kind of peer-led learning that we would do. There is, however, a big rise in the idea of increased protection measures. So the likes of PPE or up-armored vehicles is coming into the conversations more and more. Again, keeping to ourselves, but in general, armed escorts are seen as something that we can, as a sector, do without. Pass over to my colleague.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have to say that when I started working on this topic a few months ago, I was actually very surprised but concerned about the fact that the armed escorts are used in many more countries than I thought it would be. So as Anne mentioned, we do have frameworks kind of discouraging this practice, or at least framing all the conditions, all the alternative and so on. However, evidence suggests that armed escorts are becoming more and more common than exceptional, unfortunately. So we have different kind of situations, but in practice, many NGOs face the pressure from governments to accept armed escorts for protection, or at least that is the main reason that the governments are saying, but we also know that it might be in some cases the way to kind of control or monitor or control what NGOs are doing. We also have the topic of financial gain. I mean, armed escorts are not free. So we know that NGOs have to consistently reassess the necessity of using armed escorts. They have to consider the impact on their neutrality and acceptance. We talked about all of that. But the normalization of the resort to armed escorts is compounded by many times, I would say, the absence of well, what Alan was saying, that coordinated coordinated response, coordinated approach to it, and sometimes also the absence of kind of updated and localized team court guidelines in most contexts. So the lack of clear guidance can lead to inconsistent practices and potentially compromise, well, humanitarian principles and basically put NGOs at risk. So I would say that overall the trend points to a growing reliance on armed escorts as a default security measure rather than an exceptional last resort. And it raises important questions about, well, the need to comply with national laws and directives wherever we work, but the balance between security needs and the preservation of humanitarian space. And then finally, but very importantly, the risk for NGOs and the community that they serve.
Thank you, Florence, and thank you, Alan, for this. You know, from a security perspective, we determine that armed escorts are a security measure mainly because of deterrence from an attack or an incident. So if it's a choice that we choose armed escorts in a setting, and I'm interested to hear from you, how do we actually measure the level of deterrence from an attack or an incident that an armed escort actually provides us?
Thanks, Bridget. And this is a bit tricky, but it requires some really detailed analysis. And first and foremost, I'll say it should be done in collaboration with our partners, especially our NGO partners. We have different information around these factors, but really, is the group that's providing the escort a target for attack for others in the area? Basically, will they increase the likelihood of the convoy being attacked or not? What is the armed group's reputation in these communities? How are they perceived? And then what's the technical military capacity of the escorts themselves? Do they have the appropriate weaponry, training? Do they have use of force guidelines that are aligned with understanding the humanitarian nature of our convoys? Do they have the intelligence gathering and analysis in advance? Can they provide that extraction support that Alan mentioned? Basically, will they effectively discourage others from carrying out an attack on the convoy, or will they encourage, in the short or long term, increased attacks on humanitarian convoys? Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you, Anne. And Alan, did you have anything specific you wanted to add here as well from your perspective?
I suppose when we take it back to the group or the military unit that's running the convoy or running the deterrence on our behalf, it's making sure that they understand that deterrence in normal speak has to give a bit of a wow factor for the opposition. Yeah, they should turn around and go, today is not our day, we need to turn back and go home. And they also need to understand who the threat actor is. So who do we need to deter? What is their primary means of targeting convoys? Is it direct? Is it remote IEDs? Is it airstrikes or drone strikes? And do they have, as Anne said, do they have the equipment to actually counter these things? Do they have electronic countermeasures? Are we asking the right questions? Are we inside the ECM bubble inside the convoy? We also, aside from the stickers, we need to see if we have the correct vehicles and people to move inside the convoys. So armed vehicles is a really big no-no across the INGO sector, but sometimes it's needed and we don't have it. So if we're moving in an armed convoy, all vehicles should be armed, because if there's 3 vehicles that aren't armed, they're suddenly the target no matter how good the convoy is. So it's really important that all those aspects of a trip like that are actually really well thought out, they're planned, and we have everything functioning. Thanks.
Alan, we've also talked about how decisions on escorts impact other organisations. How do the decisions of some organisations to use escorts impact the activities and the work of other organisations in the same context who don't use escorts?
So I think a lot of this has been brought in at different points. But yes, like obviously using an armed escort or one organization using armed escorts has wide implications across, you know, across a region, across a country. Nothing says stay back and damages acceptance like multiple, you know, 10+ ton vehicles moving at speed through a community. It's not a good image, especially when it's followed, you know, by our typical white INGO 4x4s. And it's something we all forget, but we all look very, very similar, whether it's a UN car or whatever INGO that is operating in that area. We all typically drive white 4x4s. So at a distance, we all look the same. And it's very easy to tar one organization with the same, or to tar other organizations with that same brush. One thing that I think we always need to remember is that our working models across the different, across the sector is very different. Some of us have a very strong presence. We spend time and effort to build up that visibility. So they have, you know, everything from t-shirts on logos. They're very recognizable in an area, and others don't. Others will tip in and out. They have a strong partner on the ground that they'll primarily work with. So their in-country time is limited. But by having a lot of armed escorts in an area, it essentially means that we now will have to either conduct an armed escort, which we're unlikely to. We will possibly look at withdrawing from that area because it's not practical for us to work there anymore. Or we have to figure out a new method of moving, you know, moving into that area in a safe manner. And those options are becoming less and less with funding restrictions.
It's interesting. We do all look the same, and certainly from a distance, we look the same, and it's an important thing to remember. And turning to UNICEF specifically, what are some of the challenges that UNICEF are encountering in the use of armed escorts by humanitarian organizations?
Thanks, Bridget. And I think I'm just going to follow along a similar line to what Alan was speaking about, but it really is about when UNICEF shows up to communities with armed escorts, the perceptions around our neutrality and impartiality are significantly affected in many cases. We aim to maintain that neutrality in our operations, but when we show up with armed escorts, it compromises that picture, right? When there is already a perception of political influence, of foreign interference, the armed escorts can serve as further confirmation for communities that that is true. So that is the main challenge that we face. Also within the UN system, different UN organizations have a different risk tolerance and different role in engaging with the host government. Alan mentioned it already. When we sit in the capitals, we build these relationships with government authorities. And so some UN agencies are more likely to consider them before a last resort than other humanitarian operators. Another challenge is the risk assessment. We focus from a security perspective on the short term. What is the threat now to be able to deliver to people who need aid now? Unfortunately, we don't always consider the longer term implications of these decisions. And as Florence mentioned, we end up in a situation where we have kind of a legacy measure of armed escorts. I think when we use them in the UN, it's been mentioned, but there is the perception that INGOs will use them or have to use them, or as Alan mentioned, we look the same. So they are using them. And these different perceptions can create distrust amongst ourselves as well. And I think really the biggest challenge is the economy that is created, these vested interests in sustaining these armed escorts. Armed groups can become dependent on being escorts, especially in contexts where military actors aren't reliably paid or not paid well. So it's important that we set some clear expectations, guidelines, stipends, and oversight for how these are managed, and that planning for an exit strategy happens as early as possible so that all people engaged in this understand that this is meant to be a temporary measure. But unfortunately, we end up in these legacy systems that now are really difficult to get out of. Thanks.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk about these legacy measures and how do we walk things back in a moment. But before we do, Bill, I'm hoping to come to you and kind of bring the acceptance and the access piece together and the armed escorts. And so what role does acceptance play on the use of armed escorts? And how do we measure community acceptance?
Yes, well, I'm looking forward to also getting further into Anne's last points about how do we extract from the situation where we've been using armed escorts, because I think it is genuinely hard and there's a lot of factors as well as the economic one. I think there are psychological ones as well. But on the question of measuring acceptance, I think it's genuinely difficult. We need to know whose acceptance it is. Is it the population? Is it the authorities? Is it the military or the hierarchy? And is it the same in one village to the next when you move from one tribal area to another? In parts of Yemen, for example, it's a different group's acceptance, and you might need a different group's armed escorts. So I think what I think it is really important here is the analytical understanding of the context becomes really, really important. And this is also one of the factors in getting out of an armed escort situation. If you're relying on a sort of military protection, you don't need so much analysis as to who's accepting you or not and whether it's safe to go down that road, because you've got the safety with you. And so you can lose the fine-tuned understanding that you would need. But on the other hand, having 3 analysts is probably cheaper than having, 60 armed escort people and vehicles and so on. So that's one of the ways. So I think analysis is one. I think collaboration is the other, another key one. Within the UN, that means between security and OCHA, and then other parts of the agency's funds and programs who are out in the field, but also into the NGOs, INGOs using INSO and so on. That collaboration, so you get the fine-tuned understanding of the humanitarians into the security world and vice versa. I think that's essential. And a third factor, I think, that comes into this is our ability to negotiate with communities and with people who have power in communities. So I think those are some of the factors that help us both understand and then respond to our understanding of the level of acceptance.
Thank you. And then I think it's important to talk about peacekeeping operations, because what we're seeing now is a trend where we are removing or downsizing or shutting down peacekeeping operations. What adjustments do organizations need to make in response to this? Because in a lot of these contexts, we also are using armed escorts because there was a peacekeeping mission there.
Yeah, I'll come back in on that one as well. And that's partly having just led an interagency mission to Iraq in September, where we're looking at this question. And I think with the peacekeeping operation, you often have both the capability and the approach that a military solution to a problem is a helpful one. So you have that potential, and you can begin to rely on that approach, and armed escorts may be even done by the peacekeepers. As you move away from that and you're planning for the future without that, you've got an opportunity. It's not just that your menu of measures change. I think you're in a different restaurant, and you can actually look at it afresh. And the important thing is to do that thinking. And why is it different? It's different for a number of reasons, but one of them, first, you're going to lose the capability, but you may also have a very different reaction of the communities that you're working in. If the UN is no longer the big political or peacekeeping, it's not a political military machine, but it's there, more at the invitation of the local government to help the people, if it can rebrand as being closer to the communities it's serving, then there's an opportunity to move out of it. But it is difficult because all our people, let's be honest, who are there are used to doing it one way, and their culture and their approach needs to change, and they need to take risks. And I think, and I say take risks because I think you have to do this gradually. You have to say, well, let's try it on this route without an armed escort, and you build the confidence. Then you try it on another route, or you gradually lower it if you can, the numbers of escort, or you move the escort away from being directly in the convoy but in the proximity, so it's less visible but able to react. And gradually you can build up your confidence, and alongside it, the analysis that I mentioned before that allows you to move away. So there's definitely an opportunity when a big political or peacekeeping mission leaves to do it a different way and to reduce the dependence on armed escorts. Also depends critically on your negotiations with the host country that may by then have vested interests, or not just financial, they may also have the control value for them of having escorts to our missions.
Thank you, Bill. And I want to delve into some of the unintended consequences of escorts, and I'll turn to Florence to talk about this. Can you tell us a little bit more of some of the things we've touched on already, but what are some of the concrete unintentional consequences of using escorts?
Yes, I'll try not to repeat the very interesting things that have already been said, but of course, first of all, to say that all the risk obviously depends on the context, on the risk assessment, on the actors that are present, and everything. As Anne said, while armed escorts can be an effective deterrent regarding some risk from some actors, for other actors, it just makes the convoy become a direct target. So it can just be a direct risk, obviously, for the humanitarian in the convoy. We talked a lot about neutrality and perception by the communities, but also by the armed groups that can be present in the region. So that would, I mean, if that neutrality is compromised, that would mean more safety risk for NGOs. I want here to highlight also that also mean risk for the communities that we serve in the same way. I mean, if they've seen in the presence of armed forces, within the community while there is a distribution of aid, for example, it puts them at risk too. I touched on it a little bit, but again, there is a risk that it can be used by authorities to interfere with the humanitarian action. So basically, if they impose armed escorts to NGOs, to some extent that means that they have the power to decide where and when we can operate, right? And thinking about our independence too, that means that the armed forces will know to some extent what we provide to the communities, which communities we serve, sometimes even who our beneficiaries are. So that's another thing to take into account. And the last point I wanted to make about those consequences is that when we use armed escorts, basically, they are drawn from military or police forces in most of the case, and this can kind of divert them from other critical security tasks like patrolling and so on, so that potentially weaken the overall security environment. So that's a very brief list, but that's a few things I wanted to highlight here.
Thank you, Florence, very much. One of the things I can certainly add from the UNHCR side is when the escort themselves becomes the problem or the threat. And that is certainly a unique unintended consequence of using them. I want to talk alternatives and solutions, and then we're going to open up for questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A if you're online. I know we have a number coming in, but think of your questions if you're here in the room. So Alan, what's your organization's approach to security risk management in situations where armed escorts are not used? And what alternatives are you implementing?
So most of our work, the majority of my organization's work is through partnership. So that model allows us to access communities through very kind of local, national and local NGOs. And they have real knowledge. They understand the context that they work in. They understand how to get things done. And over time, then the Trocra brand becomes attached to their success. So over time, we gain acceptance as an organization into new areas, and it allows us to work in some very, very difficult spots. We're also very, very lucky that we have on staff, and it's not their job title, but they're very strong negotiators. They're amazing negotiators, to be fair. You know, they have this ability to look at all sides of an issue and turn the argument away from two conflicting parties and just focus on the humanitarian imperative that we have in a location. Now, there is also, like Bill mentioned it a few minutes ago, but the idea of taking risks. And one of the things I constantly advocate in our organization, and I think security leaders in general should push it, is having a tolerance level. So every organization has a risk, you know, a risk limit or a tolerance limit, appetite. There's loads of names to it, but we also need to exploit that and use that operating space to be as flexible and as and as resilient in our operations as we can be, because there's lots of measures we can do, and it doesn't always have to be the same thing all the time, but we're constantly pushing that model to try and open access, open space, and give us just a little bit of an edge.
Thank you, Alan. I think risk acceptance and risk appetite is something we discussed last year at HNPW with UNICEF, and it's something I think that the UN is very keen to explore how we talk more about acceptance and tolerance. $1 million question, Florence. How do we stop escorts?
Well, that is a very difficult question, and I guess it's probably my main key message I want to say here. For me, the decision to use armed escorts should consider its long-term consequences, because I am not aware of kind of any success story regarding stopping to use that practice when it's established. So it's basically we set a precedent that is very difficult to reverse, and that affects future humanitarian access and the perceived impartiality of humanitarian actors for a long period of time. I would be very happy to be corrected by my fellow panelists here if they have examples where we could kind of reverse in this situation. We have seen some efforts that are encouraging, though. I think about Chad, where recently, I think the end of last year, we saw some very high-level meetings regarding the use of armed escorts. You had all involved actors participating, authorities, police, and humanitarian actors sharing views, trying to find alternatives, and so on. So that's encouraging, but it's still a very difficult process. So the only thing I can say is I think the only way is that collectively strengthen our advocacy using practical arguments such as, well, first of all, basing our advocacy on facts regarding safety. We talk about the fact that using armed escorts for convoys can actually add risk by being a target for some actors. We need to talk about other mitigation measures. As always in negotiations, we have to recognize the position of the other actors, right? So we also have to recognize the efforts of the authorities to ensure security, but show them that we have alternatives, other mitigation measures, that we can say what I was saying earlier, that when armed escorts are drawn from military or police forces, well, it diverts them from crucial, critical security tasks, which is not effective, obviously. And then finally, because I talked about the fact that armed escorts can be a way for authorities to exert some control or some monitoring of the work of the NGOs, we really need to keep working and strengthen the transparency efforts. Basically, we need to find other ways to rebuild trust with them and ways that don't put us at risk and compromise the humanitarian principles.
No, that's really important, Florence. And we see the same need for that transparency and communication in a transition from a peacekeeping operation, right? Of having to really reposition the UN in that context as a different actor than one previously. I want to talk about removing legacy SRM, security risk management measures. Bill, what is needed might be wider than armed escorts. How do we better assess things and then remove things that have been in place when they have been in place for a very long time, perhaps, but now are no longer required in the context?
So I see a lot of this around the world. And I think one way of thinking about it is look at the context which were definitely in a lot worse of a security situation 5 or 10 years ago than they are now. So if you look at Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya, objectively, we're in a much better, I mean, there's still problems and there's still risks, but the overall security risk is lower. And yet we still have in many of those places quite similar practices. And it takes a long time for it to go down. And honestly, it's not just with measures. It also comes with things like, you know, entitlements for staff. It's very hard to go back down from 4 weeks to a 6-week cycle or 6 weeks to an 8-week R&R cycle. And I think the reasons are connected. It is cultural, it's psychological. There's a comfort in established practice. I'm following established practice. I'm a security officer. I'm incurring no risk by taking a decision to, no personal risk by taking a decision to ease the measures. And getting from that to the culture which Alan mentioned about exploring the scope of acceptable risk and accepting that, as we do in our concepts, that if we're doing life-saving or life-sustaining activities, we can accept risks. And so I've seen examples where some of our security leaders in the field have done this and have said, have challenged, and almost always there's a sort of a resistance from the security practitioners on the ground, from all of our agencies. Because they're used to doing it another way, and they've justified doing it a way, and they've made decisions, and undoing that is hard. So I don't have the magic wand for this, but I think we need to find ways. One of the things that I saw in Iraq, which encouraged me, was sort of a gradual testing at the edges. Do we need 2 cars? Let's try 1 car. Do we need an escort here? Let's try without an escort here if we can get the Iraqis to agree. Do we need an armed vehicle? Can we go down to a non-armed vehicle? And just trying it in gradually and building up the confidence that that's okay, that's worked, and then finding a way. That's one way. I think another way, which several have mentioned and I mentioned before, is when there's a clear and obvious difference in the if you like, the humanitarian environment, for example, the withdrawal of a mission, then that is another opportunity to explore. But I think I think the biggest thing is cultural. It's getting people to think differently about the problem. And if we can get our SRMs accurate, that should be able to underpin it, because the SRMs should show that those measures are no longer needed, and we can then get there. Just to give you an example, in Gaza, when the ceasefire happened, we moved down from using minimum two car convoys with security convoy commanders to 1 car and no security commander needed. That move down was quite controversial and difficult, but was appropriate for the risk we then faced. Of course, now we've had to go back up. But so it can be done, but it is culturally and psychologically difficult, and we need to help people through that, I think.
And it's interesting because we always talk about security needing to be agile and to adapt, and that Gaza example is exactly what we should be doing. And second last question is to you on the IASC guidelines on the use of armed escorts for humanitarian convoys. We have guidelines in place, albeit non-binding. What can we do to better operationalize this guidance?
Thanks, Bridget. And as you mentioned, the guidelines have been in place since 2013, but there is a lot of relevant information and guidance in there that's very helpful. I think first and foremost, it addresses some of the issues that Bill raised in that it paints a broader picture of the use of armed escorts than just as a security measure. It looks at the implications for humanitarian principles, and to really implement these guidelines or to put things in practice, security needs to work with access colleagues, with civil military coordination colleagues to really engage more broadly. And in that collaboration, we can help test some of our boundaries as we move through this, because it talks about a continuous revision, a continuous reassessment. But first and foremost in the guidelines are those alternatives that need to be explored first, and really with civil military coordination, engaging with militaries on things like area security. So they're not escorting the convoy, but they provide area security, or humanitarian negotiations for pauses or corridors or other alternatives. And again, this comes down to really working closely with colleagues outside of security on different approaches to manage security risks. The guidelines also talk a lot about the importance of setting up specific SOPs for the use of armed escorts, standard operating procedures, and mechanisms to manage any issues, right? So any issues with behavior or how a convoy worked well or didn't work well, issues with payments. Again, these are done usually in collaboration between security, access, and civil military coordination colleagues. And when they work, they work better, right? When all of this comes together, it can really help an area ensure that armed escorts are more of a deterrent than a risk. The other thing that's very clear in the guidelines, as we've been talking about, is that when you make a decision to use armed escorts, you also make a decision on when and how you exit, right? Any additional continued use of escorts beyond the specific geographic area, the specific time frame, requires new or more justification. And just to reiterate that civil military coordination, those colleagues play a really key role in exploring alternatives with the military. I think Bill mentioned it. When we're dealing with host government and security forces, they see a military problem with a potential military solution. So explaining and working with them from the civil military coordination perspective on humanitarian principles, on alternatives that are outlined in the guidelines, on how this could take them away from other important jobs, as Florence mentioned. Really engaging them on any oversight if we do put in place armed escorts, and then that constant communication to manage expectations with the armed group, that this is time bound, that this is for the short term, that we will be stopping this, and having that communication, that advocacy as a regular piece in our engagement is really important. Thanks, Bridget.
Just one follow-up thought. The financial crisis is a massive problem for all of us, but it does bring some opportunities. And one of those is to explain to the host government we simply can't afford it. You know, it's not that we don't like your armed escort, but we can't afford to pay for it anymore. And New York or Geneva or someone has said we need to cut that budget, so we need to work with you and find another solution. I think we should use that.
I think we should use every tool in our toolbox to wind these back. And final question to Florence before we turn to Q&A. How can we navigate better coordinated decision making? We talked about how the impact of one organization's decision impacts many. So how can we do this better, Florence?
Yes, so we talked about it. It is essential, right? The coordinated decision making, because yeah, the choice of one organization impacts the perception and the security of the others operating in the same context. So it is basically crucial to establish a common understanding of the risk, of the humanitarian principles, of the concept of last resort and all the criteria that comes with it, among, well, all actors involved. But the thing is, the humanitarian community englobes a wide variety of actors, right? It's different NGOs, local, international agencies. We have kind of development actors and more humanitarian actors. Well, all of those have different mandates, different priorities, and then different interpretations of those concepts we've been talking about. I'm thinking about that kind of difference of interpretation sometimes, or of understanding between humanitarian and development organizations. They often have differing perspective on risk and engagement with security forces. But however, in many contexts today, those organizations coexist, I think, more and more with those proactive crises. So using Armed Escorts should be guided solely by the humanitarian imperative, so the need to reach people in life-saving situations. That is also sometimes understood differently by different NGOs. It's normal, we have different understanding, but in any case, I would say it should not be influenced by programmatic commitments to donors or as means to gain acceptance from the authorities. So that could be a common base, basically. And then after working on common understanding, collective efforts are also key to build acceptance with the authorities and within the communities and to counter misinformation. I talked about it a little bit when we say, like, how do we stop using Armed Escorts or how do we not start using them is a little bit the same in terms of the need for collective efforts. So yeah, there's quite a lot of coordination spaces, HCT and so on. I think that we're now facing difficulties regarding those collective spaces and that collaboration, cooperation between humanitarian actors, because we are facing a lack of resources more and more. It's still very important for that kind of subject to be actively participating in those common spaces, to have those common understanding and have some common guidance, basically.
Yeah, and a common understanding of the role of the humanitarian coordinator or a designated official to bring those conversations together and really represent the community at large. Okay, it's now time to turn to Q&A. I have a lot of questions in the chat from online, but I'm conscious to turn to the room first. So if you have, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Alan Kalma from the Lutheran World Federation. Thank you so much for the interventions. I agree with most of what you've said. Well, I think all of it. It's interesting that we're still discussing this, considering that I think in general, most of us agree that armed escorts should be a point of last resort. For us at the LWF, if you want to use armed escorts, you need to have a specific derogation for a specific timeline that you can actually use it. It's not something that you could do unless it's something that you had to do at the spur of the moment, which will affect the safety of your staff. Then you can make a decision right there and then. So I think generally that's there. I think the problem is when it becomes a requirement from authorities. And that is when we kind of like go bilateral on certain things. And I think this is where the problem is. My question is, where does the negotiation need to happen? Because you're right, Alan. Like our colleagues, frontline, they negotiate access. They try to negotiate away from armed escorts. But this is a bigger discussions than those operational in the field offices. Sometimes it's even bigger than the national offices. So most of the time, when the negotiations happen at the country level, it's not the humanitarians who are doing the negotiation. So how do we link that? Or in your view, actually, where does the negotiation happen? And because coordination is one thing, but we coordinate amongst humanitarians, but sometimes the negotiations happen outside of the humanitarian sector. The second thing is, do you feel that that we as a sector are being a bit hypocritical when it comes to armed escorts? Because you see a lot of organizations who sort of like, condemn the use of armed escorts in certain situations, but then the same organizations use armed escorts in certain aspects, using deterrence as an issue or duty of care. And sometimes not even with the government, but with, you know, the non-state armed groups, because that's the only way to access those. Do you think it's hypocritical? And if so, how do you draw the line between deterrence and actually a justification for duty of care or for the humanitarian imperative to access those that need assistance the most? Thank you.
We're earning our money today. Fabulous questions, and thank you so much. So I'm opening it up to the panelists. Please raise your hand if you would like to discuss the negotiations, the importance of negotiations on the imposition of armed escorts. Alan, over to you.
I'm not going to be able to answer it all, to be fair, but you're right. The negotiation does happen a lot of the time at a state level, at a level that some NGOs just can't reach. But at the same time, there still is, like in a lot of the areas we work, there is local, there's state, there's federal forces, and whilst an armed escort might be attempted to be pushed on us, we still have a lot of power in the area, and the negotiations don't always have to happen by our staff. They can happen by an intermediary. Like we can talk to a district commissioner or someone high up within the community and ask them to be our focal person for that negotiation, and just to explain that we really have to stay neutral, you know, for X, Y, and Z reasons. And that's definitely something that has worked for us in the past, using intermediaries, aside from, you know, that unique staff member that has that ability to communicate across the sector. But it's definitely one of those questions that's context driven, and I fully agree that in some areas it's not as easy to say that strong negotiations is the answer. But happy to hand over to someone else in the panel if they have other views.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, I can add a little bit from the UNHCR side. So one of the things that we see is that oftentimes at the district or at the community level, we're able to negotiate with that contingent or a smaller group to remove an escort. Where we're seeing bigger challenges is when we have perhaps a member state imposing it on us as an organisation blanket. And that's where, as you said, the decisions are made at quite a senior level. And sometimes the conversation comes to the regional bureau or even headquarters here in Geneva to have a conversation or advise on the positioning vis-a-vis the guidelines and the organisation's appetite. But again, it's often entwined with also our ability to operate in a space or our relationships with the government. So it becomes quite complicated, specifically in countries where it's difficult to navigate those conversations. I want to turn to your second question on how do we draw the line between deterrence, the use of armed escorts and duty of care, and open that up to the panelists.
Yeah, maybe I can. Sorry, I don't find the thing to raise my hand, but maybe I can start. Just quickly saying, well, I think that it is a conversation that has to happen within the NGO, and it's answering a little bit both questions. We need to have clear guidance within the NGO. I talked much about the collective efforts, but within our organization, we also have to have a clear guidance, because those negotiations you're talking about, they have to happen at all levels, right? We see that in some countries. I'm thinking about Sahel in particular, where we have imposition of armed escorts, but with different interpretation within the authorities at local level, regional level, national level, and so on. So we need to be able to respond to that. So those discussions have to happen within the organization, have a clear guidance on what the NGO or the organization wants to do and is ready to accept. So at all level, everybody is aware of that and able to navigate those restrictions of access and so on. And it's a little bit the same when we talk about balancing the duty of care with the humanitarian principle, deterrence and risk and so on. It is important conversations that happen, but need to be more highlighted, I think, for all staff of the NGOs. What is our risk tolerance, what are we ready to accept, and what risk are we going to face because of the humanitarian imperative, and like kind of agree and have those conversations within the team about those concepts and understanding.
Thank you, Florence. Did you want to?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think I don't see hypocrisy. I see inconsistency in a very federated model where countries and circumstances and people are different, and they come to different solutions. And we see that across the board, not just on this issue. But it's sometimes we can help give guidance that helps people come in a better direction. On the negotiation point, I mean, yes, of course, sometimes it's at a national level, and that needs to be done by sometimes us at the highest level, I mean, above security, if you see what I mean, at the political level. And, you know, we just need to be able to muster the arguments that work at the different levels, I think.
Whilst colleagues in the room are thinking of questions, I have a number online. I might go to one now. Whilst international law, we're seeing a degradation of international humanitarian law, how can humanitarian organizations ensure compliance with IHL whilst using escorts in high threat environments? Can we? Might open up another question just in case. I was wondering if the panelists could talk more about the concern of enabling or legitimizing surveillance or monitoring of affected or other populations by armed escorts. They've given an example of social media monitoring, and whether these factors or these concerns should be part of negotiations with these actors on escorts.
Thanks, Bridget. Oh,
you go ahead.
I'll start and then hand over to you, Bill. These are definitely tricky questions, but very relevant, right? I think one on IHL, there's always been a little bit of, in some contexts, conflict between the principles themselves and which we choose, how we implement them, how we reach those in need in the most effective way. I think it comes down to that balancing act, but also, as we said, different organizations in different contexts interpret or kind of rate risks differently, right? So when we need to reach a group in need, can we do it? Can partners do it? Can we do it high profile? Should it be low profile? Assessing all those risks, noting the urgency of many of the contexts that we're in, there isn't that much time. So people take decisions based upon what they think is the most effective way to reach people in need. And they, you know, sometimes those have longer term implications. And that's what we're managing in many cases with armed escorts. On the enabling monitoring question, I think that's very valid. We're seeing that more and more. Government authorities impose escorts. We have access and acceptance in communities they don't, and suddenly they are now in these communities. I think this is important to include in our analysis and our feedback, and maybe that group is no longer an effective deterrent. So how can we shift our approach? Again, engaging with them, coming up with key messages so that we can access the populations in need and also ensure that we don't do further harm to those populations. And Bill, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. And I'm definitely going to duck the difficult question about international humanitarian law. But on the question of control and surveillance, I think it is something that worries me, and it worries me partly because we find it difficult to have an open conversation about it. It's clear on the ground that governments or non-state actors or de facto authorities sometimes want to exert control and surveillance over their own population. Sometimes they want to exert control and surveillance over what the UN or humanitarian actors are doing. It's very clear. It's a difficult one for the UN, which is made up of member states, to address and to be really to have a proper conversation about. And I think it links to the point that Anne made earlier about how do we manage reports of extortion or manipulation, because sometimes those are being done by the authorities, whether member state or de facto authorities. I just think we need to open up and be able to have that conversation, because it's happening more and more around the world. And if we don't address it, we will see it even more. It'll accelerate.
Before I go to the next question, I'll touch on the IHL question from the UNHCR perspective. We had a good example last year where jointly with WFP, UNHCR, and WFP led a conversation at the country representative, country director level in a context when we had our escort provider accused of certain crimes against a particular population that we were actually providing protection to. And because we had protection colleagues who had information and shared that information with the other agencies who were also using the escorts, we were actually quite successful in changing some of the behavior in that context and having a conversation on what was acceptable for us if you were going to continue to escort us in that context. So that's one positive example from the IHL perspective. We have a question here on decision making. Is decision making processes different for armed escorts provided by a government as opposed to a de facto authority or a commercial or private entity? Does it bring up different questions for your organization in terms of appetite?
I can start maybe.
Thank you.
Yes, there's you're right. There's a wide variety of actors in the providing armed escorts too. It does bring up different questions because in a way it has different kind of influence and consequences for the humanitarian principles and neutrality and so on. What I want to highlight here is that the discussion cannot stop there, even if some actors can be seen as less, let's say, harmful for our neutrality. We also have to think about the perception of the communities, of the armed groups and everything. Will they know the difference? Will they see the difference? So although in a theoretical kind of level, I would say, yeah, it makes a big difference. On a practical level, I would say probably not in many cases. The decision remains the same and remains, again, a very impactful one, yes.
I think it's worth saying that for the UN, obviously, there is a difference between how we interact with the member state and how we interact with a de facto authority. And, we can see that in our ability to operate in different bits of Sudan, for example. So I think there are differences, although I agree with you that the actual problem on the ground is often very similar. There are sort of legal differences to how we can deal with the parties.
Yeah, that was certainly my experience in Northwest Syria. So we weren't able to use escorts in Northwest Syria because the de facto authorities were actually listed as terrorist organization at the time. But in broader Syria, in the government-held territories, we were using escorts. So even parts of countries, we have a different approach or a decision based on that factor. Any other questions? Claire?
I've got it. I've never been in a room this big before. It's very exciting. Hi, I'm Claire. I'm a humanitarian specialist advising the FCDO. Question on the negotiations and in what context, if any, donors can be helpful in helping partners roll back armed escorts. What would you want to ideally see from your donors? Obviously recognizing it's very context dependent and would depend on the actor you're negotiating with. Are there situations where donors have been helpful in these conversations that you found? And are there any examples? And also where might you want us to butt out? It would be really useful to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Opening up to the panelists for a fabulous question from Claire. Anyone online? Sure, Phil?
Yeah, no, Alan, go for it. I'll complete.
So thank you, Claire. One of the key things is the speed and the length of time it takes to build relationships, especially if you're looking at a new location. So we find sometimes donors can be maybe not so understanding on the time frame that it takes to actually get a foot in and to actually build that relationship with local actors, local communities. And one of the key things that we've been finding, and it was brought up, I don't know where you were at the conference in Dublin in February, but was funding. And funding that ensures that security is constantly on that agenda for both donors and NGOs and like everyone down the chain, that we are always talking about security, because security is an enabling activity. We allow all this to go ahead. If we don't have a secure and safe environment, it's very, very hard for us as humanitarians to deliver what we're there to do. But we always forget that we also need to fund that. We need the correct staff on the ground. They need to be in there in advance to do those negotiations. We need, there's so many aspects that have to fall into place to allow us to work effectively. And yeah, I think donors can definitely assist in two areas. One is time to allow us to get in there effectively, and the second one then is funding. Always make sure that if it's forgotten at an organizational level at the lower end, that you remind us to budget it in. I'm sure there's someone else on the panel now that will jump in.
Yeah, thank you for the.
Yes, sorry.
Florence, we'll go to Bill and then I'll come back to you.
Yes.
Thank you, Claire, for the question. I think sometimes it's helpful for donors to twist our arm behind our back. But we need to tell you when we need you to do that. Because no, sometimes the argument, the negotiation with the member state or the de facto authority can be strengthened by saying, look, simply our donors won't allow that, where they can't allow the money that we're using to be spent on armed escorts. It's a question of when and how, and using that skillfully, not as a blunt weapon, I think.
And over to you, Florence.
Yes, well, it is on the same line, but yeah, I wanted to insist on the fact that those negotiations take time, and then the decision of using armed escorts or not has to be made on those criteria we talked about, but not on the commitments of operations that we made with donors, basically. That is not a criteria, and it seems obvious, but I think that in the field sometimes it's not. It's a bit like, we made a commitment to donors, but to the community, of course, that we would gonna do that. It's gonna be quicker if you accept the imposition of armed escorts instead of spending a lot of time negotiating. And I think that there it's very crucial for donors to be open to that discussion and to be open to any kind of modification. And again, giving time, as Alan was saying, to make a proper decision-making process and so on. And just maybe add that I go back to the collective efforts that are needed for advocacy. When we talk about humanitarian diplomacy at large, I think that in many contexts, many donors have the right seat at the table to be able to push some of the arguments. So again, hearing what the NGOs, what the humanitarian community is saying in general, and then being able, well, when possible, relay it in those other kind of spaces they have access to on a more political level and so on, has been proven very helpful. And then I hope it continues and can be for armed escorts in a lot of contexts now.
Thank you, Florence, and thank you, Claire, for the question. Do we have any other questions in the room before I turn back? Yes.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, just wondering, because I heard there was an incident a few years ago with an organization which actually used an armed escort which turned against the staff. And so is this risk really to be taken into account every day when we use armed escorts, and how we can make sure that it doesn't affect our staff, and especially in environments where, like for first field interventions, when we don't really know the actors and we don't have much knowledge of the sector at this scale? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and you're asking the right people as their security risk managers. So in terms of the panel, how can we better understand the risks of an escort, right? And what implications it may have for us and the safety and security of our colleagues? Anyone? Bill?
I'm not really answering, I'm adding to your question. It's not just the risk from the escort when you're on the convoy or the mission, but it's the risk that the economy, a bit like a mafia, you know, if you want to protect, if you're running an insurance racket, you need to break some windows and rob a few stores. So, you know, do you get groups creating incidents that require you to have an armed escort? Or when you're thinking about stopping an armed escort, do the rate of incidents go up? So I think it's a really difficult one to manage, and we need to be. It's one of the reasons why it's harder to get out than to get in, and we need to be really careful about the decision to go in.
Florence, I see your hand up as well, so over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to, I mean, I don't have in mind that incident you're talking about, so I just wanted to make a point that I wanted to make earlier and I did not, so it's I take my chance. We talk about armed escorts, but we did say, I mean, it can come from a variety of factors. I want to highlight a little bit the logistical issues that can be. An armed escort is not the same in a context or another from an actor to another. And another thing is, if we are in that last resort context where we decide that we have to use armed escorts, then there's still a lot of work to be done about which armed escort, how many people, how many vehicles, how are they trained, how will they communicate, how will they take the decision to engage in a combat or not, and that kind of thing. I mean, I think it doesn't really answer your question, but it's a huge concern. The worries and the preoccupation doesn't stop when we decided to use armed escorts. Then we have to see how it's done and make sure it's done in the best way possible.
Bridget, can I come in briefly?
Absolutely.
To second much of what Florence said and expand upon it, but I think it really is about the continuous reassessment of whether or not these armed escorts are still a deterrent and an effective measure. And that doesn't happen in many locations. We've touched on it. It becomes a legacy thing, and that's just the way that we do things. The other thing that's important that we talk about when this works better, there is an SOP in place, so it addresses many of those logistical issues that Florence mentioned. How many people, how does the convoy move? What are the different ways of working when you're out and about? And that mechanism, whether it's through the Access Working Group, civil military coordination, to report and manage any incidents or issues with the armed escorts, that mechanism is in place, that staff use it, that there's a regular communication when there is an issue. And sometimes from a security perspective or other, we don't hear about this right away, right? Other colleagues hear about it and we don't. But in other cases, there's just no mechanism to report. Staff don't know who to talk to, how we can get this fixed and how it can be addressed. So having those systems in place are really important. And unfortunately, they are lacking in many places, which only exacerbates the problem.
Sorry to come back in, but just to agree very much with Anne on a lot of that. But I think the question actually, just zooming out a bit, it raises quite an important truth about the world we live in, which is that the boundaries between state, non-state, official, criminal, terrorist, insurgent are just more fluid. And so, and we can see all of those boundaries being crossed in different environments that we're working in now, and states with terrorist elements, or terrorists who become states, or criminal groups that capture a state, or a state that has, and you could just see all of those variations. And the consequence, I think, for us is the need for really good analysis and assessment underpinning that. And of course, the most difficult environment is when you're first. You're the NGO that's first on the ground. There's no one else there. You don't have that information, and you've got to do it from scratch. But that's the conclusion that I come to is the importance of analysis. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to close Q&A, but please do continue to grab us on the side if you're in the room, if you'd like to speak to any of us. We might turn to final reflections and go one by one through the panel. So I'm looking first at Alan, who's first on my screen. Any last thoughts to wrap up today's conversation, Alan?
All my thoughts have been thoroughly expressed throughout the session, but it's a really interesting discussion and a very, very hard dilemma, and it's definitely one of those that we have to keep edging forward. We have to keep pushing and always trying to drop the armed actor from any of our operations. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you. What about yourself, Florence?
Yes, the same. I think I've repeated a little bit the points I wanted to say in this conclusion. So nothing new here, but just to repeat that decision is a very important one. Using Armed Escorts or not, accepting or not to use Armed Escorts has to be taken after very careful consideration, following the IASC guidelines. And this is because of all the risk associated with that decision for us humanitarian, but also for the communities we serve. And again, the very huge difficulty to reverse once the practice is implemented. And then highlight again the importance of collective work on it, on everything that leads to the decision making, the context, the analysis, the common understanding, and finally getting to common guidelines. I think it's key. It's not easy because of the variety of actors, but also because of the lack of resources, which the financial crisis obviously will exacerbate.
Thank you, Florence. And any final words of wisdom from you, Anne, at UNICEF?
Thanks, Bridget, and thanks, colleagues, for the very good discussion today. This is a challenging reality that we face in many of our operating contexts. And I think that discussions like these are important so that we can highlight and really talk about some of the issues, challenges, any success stories that we have or ways that things have worked well, and to continue to sensitize colleagues to the guidelines. Right, they exist. There's a lot of great information. Many don't see armed escorts as a last resort, and how we can do better and internally and collectively to sensitize that. But also just to say, as Florence mentioned, with this financial reality, it is an opportunity, and Bill highlighted this, an opportunity to review what risk management measures we have in place, which ones may no longer make sense. And in many cases, armed escorts are one of those, that this is an opportunity for us to revisit how we do business. Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you, Anne. And final thoughts, Bill?
So I found it very stimulating. Thank you, everyone. And I think that we have a remarkable unanimity of views on this. But it's a problem that doesn't get solved by unanimity of view, because there's a lot of momentum and established practice and culture and so on. So I think it requires sort of active engagement and leadership if we're to make progress. That would be my main conclusion, because we all agree it's a problem, but solving it will take effort.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you everyone for being here, both in the room and online today. Certainly from UNHCR's perspective, we're very keen to engage on this issue and to move the needle positively the other direction. So please drop by. Some of our team are here as well in the audience if you want to talk more. And for those online, we look forward to further discussions somewhere in the field. All right, have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
And thank you for being so early this morning.